Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're all based around Shanghai, and it's a wonderful city. I remember going there first 49 years ago and fascinated by the history of Shanghai, the history of China. Some of the people I met, like Wang Daohan, the former mayor of Shanghai, with my mother and father. It's a great place. The tea restaurant, I remember, but fascinating. The Peace Hotel, so many things about it. But overall, the most important memory I have is of the Bund, of people coming together and being at ease with each other and doing whatever it is that they wanted to do, go for a walk, go for a stroll, look at the river. I remember looking across from the Peace Hotel at the other side of the river. It was not much there, and at night it was dark. And now it's one of the greatest financial centers of the world, Pudong. The transformation of Shanghai is the transformation of China. And we have a problem that's cropped up in the middle of this huge development forward of not only Shanghai, not only of China, but of large areas of the world. And that is COVID. COVID has come along, and everybody's had to switch off their economies, lock down, and see if they could defeat it. There has been a containment of COVID, and now we're looking at the possibility that vaccines may contain it. Let's hope so. But it's already clear that the economic recovery, is difficult to organise, that there are problems resulting from the switch-offs, and it's not so easy to get a container from the Pacific to the Atlantic anymore, except at very high prices. That's just one of the examples of the difficulties that are emerging of a recovery from COVID. The leaders of the world have got to organise themselves very effectively to minimise the impact of COVID on the recovery period. It could be negative, and it could be that the sharp recovery in economic growth is followed by some considerable uncertainty in economies. We're already seeing that in the UK. So let me leave that point there, because that one is yet to emerge. It's difficult to define. When one looks at the other major question raised by the organisers of this conference, it is about the dual circulation philosophy of the Chinese economy and how it's going to impact on China and the world. And any observations that I have, and others more eminent than me, will make as this conference proceeds. The first point to make is that very few people in the world have any real idea of what dual circulation is about. We're sitting looking at these phrases about dual circulation, explanations of it, but frankly, it's difficult to get a full grip on. For me, it's about moving out of low-cost exports to domestic consumer demand, to make the domestic economy of China the king rather than the export industry that was focused on export markets. It's a big change. It's a sensible change. We must understand that what China was trying to do from 1978 was to mechanize agriculture, and to do that, to free the peasants. 800 million, probably 1 billion of the population of China was in the countryside, and they had to be freed from being tied to the land. Everything was done by hand. We used to go across China, and all you'd see was peasants in the fields, often in the water, in order to sow and collect the crops. They had very hard lives. The mechanization of agriculture will free them from that. The movement of them into the cities and towns, particularly on the East Coast, was accompanied by a big increase in export activity by China. And I and many others were very surprised that China could transform itself from a domestic economy to an export economy in 10 years. It was truly an incredible change. But if one looks now, that's happening in reverse. China's not moving its economy back to the countryside, but it's moving its economy from low-cost exports to a much more sophisticated form of economy. And the domestic demand is gradually becoming the main driver in the Chinese economy. At the same time, China is committed to being in the world, and it talks about dual circulation. That's how to manage the changing cycles of the international market with the changing cycles of the domestic market. I'll leave it for other economists to talk about that and explain it. But for me, I associate this very much with a trend which I've observed, which is I call the three regions trend. And it seems to me that one is looking at China viewing the world as being about three regions. North America, perhaps including Central and South America in time. The second one, Europe, obviously centered on the European Union, but there are many countries like the UK and Russia that are European and are not part of the European Union. And then the third region is Asia, and that is the biggest region, the most complex region, but the region with the most potential. And that is what looks to me to be the focus of China, of being an Asian nation and sharing with other major Asian nations, Japan, South Korea, India, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, to share with them in building a continent linked by open trade, free investment, or substantially free, and the people's able to move around so that there's a much freer labour market. It would lead to a much greater spread of populations than's currently the way. So if you link the three regions and you come to the conclusion, as I do, that China sees itself as being part of Asia and that it wants to do what it can to build the innovation and the entrepreneurial flair of the people of Asia, open borders, move infrastructure from the Pacific to the Turkish end of Asia, but also into Europe and into Africa, that China sees itself very much as being within Asia. So if you ask yourself the question, what does dual circulation mean for the international world? I think there's a problem here that people in the West haven't fully absorbed. I think what happened in the first decade of this century was an enormous, in the last decade of the previous century as well. China built its first level of exports on trade with Europe and North America. Took about 70% of Chinese exports, and imports in many cases reflected those numbers a bit less because a lot of the raw materials come from Africa and other parts of the world. But if you look at what has happened, the share of European and North American trade with China has come down closer to the 30% level. And what's taking its place is BRI trade, Asian trade, trade with the developing world. China said they were going to do that about 20 years ago. And when they said that they were going to make their consumer goods the biggest export in the world, we did not think it was very easy to do. We doubted they could do it. They did it. And shifting their commerce to developing countries was also something that they said they would do, and they have done it. So I think that will increase. So access to the domestic market will not be limited by geographical source, but it's inevitable as the UK, 56% of its trade goes to Europe. So the majority of China's outward trade will be with Asia, and the majority of Asia's trade will be with China. That's going to be the biggest and most powerful market in Asia. It's probably going to be the biggest economy in the world within 5 or 10 years. And its focus on innovation is going to ensure that it continues to be the biggest economy in the world. And the international part of that will be substantial. And of that, the main focus will be Asian suppliers and Asian buyers. So for the Western economies, the question they have to work out is how to be Asian. How can Western companies be Asian? I could give you some answers to that question. If you want to hire me, I'll give them to you. No, I'm only joking. I think that It's a question that faces many companies. Maybe they have to have an Asian subsidiary with an Asian identity, an Asian profile. Maybe they'll find that being Western continues to be a great attraction for a variety of reasons to do with health security and other things like that. But there is a change coming in the Chinese market. So we have ahead of us the prospect that Chinese growth, which has been about 30% of world growth for the last 15, 20 years, some people worry that it'll reduce. I think it'll stay up there with relatively high numbers, maybe 2025 rather than 30. Not that I have any great science for those numbers. They're just what I do. I kind of estimate what I think will be the impact. But if one looks at what will happen with BRI, that's going to take the place of any reduction in Chinese share of world growth, probably exceed it. So I think we're probably looking at the combination of BRI and China as probably pushing well above the 30% level out ahead. So for Western companies, for Asian companies, you have to really come to terms with understanding what will be the nature of that marketplace in China over the next 10, 15, 20 years. The way President Xi has expressed it with the new era through to 2035, you can expect it to be beginning to become obvious by then, building through to the next centenary target of 2049, probably even clearer still. But you could look at the 4 regions that China's opening. You could look at the impact that GBA, the Greater Bay Area, will have within ASEAN. There are so many other parts to this puzzle that we need to work out. China's saying to us, this is going to be the trend, the dual cycle. What they're not saying is clearly where they're planning to take it, and that is China's right to withhold on areas of their projections where they're not sure, where they're ready to react and change. At the core of it is something called the scientific method, and that's what we all need to understand, what it is that China is looking and assessing and planning to do over the next 10 or 20 years. And I would leave you with this thought. The West has really very little idea of what China is doing and where it's going. Some in the West think China wants to become a hegemon and become the most powerful nation in the world. It's possible. I think the Chinese look at the effect of being the empire, the dominant nation in the world, as not being very constructive to the long-term interests of the nation. I don't think China wants to become a hegemon. I think China wants to be a significant factor in Asia, and they want Asia to be a significant factor in the world. But we're talking about a timescale here of 50 to 100 years. And let me leave you with this thought of mine. When I went to China 49 years ago for the first time, 90% of the population were peasants. The middle class was probably 2 or 3%, 4%. Now the middle class are over 400 million. The peasantry virtually disappeared. They will become agricultural working class and agricultural entrepreneurs to the region of about 20% of the population. About 20% of the population will be in manufacturing. 60% of the population will be middle class mainly. And that is an incredible achievement, as China will be the first country in the world where the middle class will be the largest class in China. Have a nice day.